All right, so get this. You know how everyone's always saying water scarcity is going to be a problem in the future? Well, what if I told you Earth is actually losing fresh water, like right now, and it's happening crazy fast? Scientists are really trying to figure out what's going on.
It is really interesting because we're able to actually see this happening like in real time thanks to these incredible satellites NASA launched called GRACE.
Grace, okay.
Yeah, and so imagine like a giant cosmic scale, but like one that's sensitive enough to measure these tiny shifts in Earth's gravity. That's what GRACE is doing.
Wow.
So as water moves around, whether it's ice melting or rainfall patterns changing or groundwater depletion, all of that stuff subtly alters the gravitational pull in that area,
Mm.
and GRACE picks up on these changes. So it's giving us this like incredibly precise map of how water is distributed across the planet.
So it's not just about like how much rain falls, it's about like where that water ends up.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
whether it soaks into the ground and replenishes aquifers or runs off the surface or just like evaporates away.
Right, right.
And what's really alarming is that starting around 2014, scientists started noticing this. Like really sudden, significant drop in fresh water levels. Way more than they could explain from, normal fluctuations.
Oh, wow.
It's like someone just flipped a switch and suddenly 2.5 times the volume of Lake Erie just vanished.
Poof, gone. That's wild. So, what are the leading theories here? Is this just a natural blip or is something more serious happening?
Well, the timing is interesting because it coincides with some of the most intense droughts we've seen like in recent history.
Okay.
Brazil, for example, was hit like incredibly hard back in 2014. And since then, we've seen a cascade of severe droughts across the globe. Australia, South America, North America, even parts of Europe and Africa are experiencing these increasingly dry spells.
Yeah, I remember hearing about those California droughts a few years back. Things got pretty serious out there, and it definitely made people more aware of just how important water is. But, I mean, are these droughts just purely natural, or are we contributing to the problem?
It's definitely a mix of factors, but human activity is definitely playing a role.
Okay.
Think about it, as the population grows, so does the demand for food. And that means more agriculture, which requires massive amounts of water. And when there isn't enough rainfall, we often turn to those underground aquifers to make up the difference.
So we're essentially tapping into like these reserves that nature has built up over centuries.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where it gets tricky. If we keep extracting water from those aquifers faster than the rain or snow can replenish them, we risk depleting them entirely. It's like overdrawing your bank account.
Yeah.
Eventually, you're going to run out of money.
So even if my local rainfall seems totally normal, this global trend could still impact me.
Absolutely. It's not just about whether your lawn is getting enough water.
Yeah.
These dwindling freshwater reserves have huge implications for things like food prices, regional stability, even the potential for future conflicts over resources.
Yeah.
Imagine like those California droughts happening more frequently in more places around the world. It could be a recipe for serious trouble.
Okay, so we've got drought, we've got agriculture putting a strain on those water resources, but what about climate change? Where does that fit into all of this?
Yeah, the big one. Climate change is kind of acting like an amplifier.
Okay.
It makes all of these problems worse and more severe, and as global temperatures rise, the oceans warm up, and that has a huge impact on weather patterns.
But how does a warmer ocean lead to less fresh water?
So warmer water evaporates faster, right? Which means there's more water vapor in the atmosphere, but instead of falling back down as like gentle, steady rainfall, we're seeing more of these intense downpours followed by these long periods of dryness.
So it's like trying to water your garden with a fire hose.
Yeah, exactly. Most of it just runs off and doesn't have a chance to soak in.
Right.
And on a global scale, that's what's happening with those vital aquifers. They're just not getting replenished at the rate they need to be because the water isn't staying put long enough to really permeate the soil. We're seeing this happen with El Nino, for example.
Oh, right. El Nino, the thing that messes with temperatures and rainfall.
Yeah, exactly. So the El Nino that started in late 2014 was particularly strong, and it messed with like jet streams and rainfall patterns all over the planet.
Yeah, but didn't El Nino end eventually?
It did, but the thing is, global freshwater levels never really bounced back. They stayed really low even after El Nino was gone. And that's kind of a red flag. It suggests that something bigger is happening, something that's driving this ongoing freshwater decline.
And that something is probably global warming, right?
Yeah. Most likely, the 9 warmest years on record have all occurred since 2015. The same time this big freshwater decline began. It's a pretty hard correlation to ignore.
That's pretty compelling, but I did see one point of skepticism in the research. One scientist pointed out that it's hard to directly link climate change to this freshwater decline.
Yeah, that's fair. While all the evidence is pointing towards climate change as a major driver, there's always some uncertainty in science, and we should acknowledge that.
So even with all this data pointing to global warming, we still can't definitively say it's the sole cause.
Exactly. Attributing specific events just to climate change is tricky. But it's important to look at the overall trend, and the bigger picture is telling us that our planet is losing fresh water at an alarming rate, and we need to figure out why and what we can do about it.
Okay, so we've got this massive puzzle to solve. We've got drought, unsustainable agricultural practices, and climate change all mixed together. So where do we even begin to untangle this mess?
Well, that's what we're going to get into next. We'll explore the potential consequences of this freshwater decline, and most importantly, what steps we can take to address this crisis.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us, but hey, that's what deep dives are all about, right? Let's get to it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so we've established that the Earth is losing fresh water at this alarming rate, and this has serious implications for agriculture, regional stability, and maybe even global security. It kind of paints a bleak picture, to be honest. So is there any hope here? Is there a chance that freshwater levels could rebound, or are we just headed toward a permanently drier future?
That's the big question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer. The research that we're looking at suggests it really remains to be seen whether global freshwater will rebound back to pre-2015 values, hold steady at these lower levels, or continue to decline even further.
So it's a wait-and-see kind of thing, but we're not just passively waiting around, right? I mean, we have the ability to make choices that could influence the outcome.
We're not just helpless bystanders here. Our actions today, both individually and collectively, are going to have a big impact on the future of water availability.
Okay, so what are the key factors that are going to determine whether or not freshwater levels recover?
Well, precipitation patterns are obviously huge. Will we see a return to more balanced rainfall, or will these extreme weather events, those intense downpours followed by long dry spells, become the new normal?
And how does climate change factor into that?
Well, as we talked about, warmer temperatures lead to more evaporation and more erratic precipitation patterns. So the trajectory of climate change, whether we manage to curb greenhouse gas emissions and limit warming, or whether we continue down our current path, will play a big role in shaping future freshwater availability.
So if we can get our act together and start taking climate change seriously, there's a chance we might see some recovery in freshwater levels.
Yeah, that's definitely the hope. But it's important to remember that these climate systems are really complex, and there's always some uncertainty. Even if we drastically cut emissions tomorrow, there's a lag time before those changes show up in global temperatures and precipitation patterns.
So we're essentially conducting this giant experiment with our planet, and we don't know for sure what the results are going to be.
In a way, yeah, but we're not just passive observers in this experiment, right? We have the power to influence the outcome through our actions and our choices.
This brings us back to that importance of individual responsibility and collective action. We can't just sit around and wait for governments or scientists to fix this problem. What can we do as everyday people to address this freshwater crisis?
That's the spirit. And the good news is that there are a ton of things we can do. For starters, reducing our own water consumption is crucial.
Okay.
And it's not just about taking shorter showers or fixing leaky faucets, although this is definitely help. It's about being aware of our overall water footprint, the amount of water that we use directly and indirectly through the products that we buy and the food that we eat.
So just being aware of where our water comes from and how much we're using is a good first step.
Definitely. Even in areas where water seems plentiful, it's important to remember that those resources are finite and interconnected with other regions. We can also support sustainable agriculture practices that prioritize water conservation and soil health.
That makes sense. Are there specific things that we should be looking for, like labels or certifications that indicate sustainable farming practices?
Yeah, totally look for labels like organic regenerative or water-wise when you're shopping for food.
Okay.
These indicate that the farmers are using practices that minimize water use and protect the soil. You can also support your local farmers markets. You can often talk directly to the farmers and learn about their methods.
What about policy changes? Are there things that governments can do to encourage these changes and make a real difference?
Oh, for sure. Governments can play a huge role by investing in water infrastructure, improving irrigation efficiency, promoting drought-resistant crops, and implementing water pricing mechanisms that reflect the true value of water.
So making sure that water isn't undervalued and wasted.
Exactly. And of course, tackling climate change is really important too.
Right.
Things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions,
Yeah.
transitioning to renewable energy sources, and promoting sustainable land management practices are all super important for mitigating the long-term effects of global warming on freshwater availability.
It sounds like a multifaceted challenge that requires a combination of individual action, policy changes, and technological innovation. It feels a little bit overwhelming.
I get that it's a big issue, but the good news is that we have the knowledge, the tools, and the ingenuity to actually make a difference. We just need the will to act.
Hopefully this deep dive will help inspire some of that, Will. By understanding how big and urgent this problem is, we can empower ourselves and others to make better choices.
Totally. Awareness is the first step, and that's what we're trying to do today.
Right.
By talking about this issue, we can help shift the conversation and inspire action.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem, the potential consequences, and some of the things that we can do to address it, but I'm curious, what about those unanswered questions? The research mentioned that scientists are still figuring out some key uncertainties.
Yeah, you're right. There are still a lot of things that we don't totally understand about the Earth's water cycle and how it's being impacted by climate change and human activity. One of the biggest questions is whether these changes in freshwater availability are temporary or permanent.
Right.
Like, will those freshwater levels eventually rebound, or is this the new normal?
Yeah, that's a pretty big question. It would change how we approach this whole issue, right?
Yeah, totally. If it's a temporary thing, we might be able to adapt and manage our water resources accordingly. But if this is a permanent shift, it will require us to completely rethink our relationship with water.
So we're basically waiting for more data, more research to give us a clearer picture of what the future holds.
Kind of. But that doesn't mean that we should just sit around and wait.
Mm.
We can't afford to be complacent. We need to act now based on the information we do have to mitigate the risks and protect this resource for ourselves and future generations.
I think that's a really important point. We don't have to have all the answers before we start taking action.
Exactly. We can't let uncertainty paralyze us. There's a lot we can do right now to make a difference, and the longer we wait, the harder and more expensive those solutions are going to become.
So what are some concrete things we can do today? I know we've talked about them a little bit, but let's give our listeners some specific actions they can take in their own lives.
Great idea. Let's break it down into a few key areas, starting with what we can do on a personal level.
Okay, let's start there. What are some things we can all do at home in our daily lives to actually make a difference?
Well, as we said before, reducing our water consumption is huge. This means being mindful of how much water we're using for things like showering, washing dishes, watering our lawns, even flushing the toilet.
Those everyday things that we just don't even think about.
Right, and there are simple things we can do that make a big difference, like installing low-flow shower heads and faucet aerators can significantly reduce water usage without sacrificing any performance.
Those are pretty easy upgrades, too. I've
Yeah.
been meaning to switch out my shower head for a while. It's like standing under a waterfall every time I take a shower.
Tell me about it. It's amazing how much water those old shower heads use up.
Yeah.
Another really simple thing is to fix any leaks quickly. A leaky faucet or toilet can waste gallons of water every day.
Yeah, they're easy to ignore, but it really adds up over time.
For sure. And speaking of things that add up, think about the water footprint of your diet.
Okay.
Meat production, particularly beef, requires a ton of water.
Yeah.
So cutting back even just a little bit can have a real impact.
So maybe Meatless Monday isn't just a trendy hashtag. It could actually make a difference.
Exactly. And don't forget about food waste. When you throw away food, you're also wasting all of the water that went into growing, processing, and transporting it.
That's like throwing gallons of water in the trash can. That's crazy.
It really is. So being mindful of your portion sizes, storing your food properly, and composting food scraps are all great ways to reduce waste and conserve water.
Okay, so we've talked about reducing water usage at home. What about supporting sustainable agriculture? How can we encourage farming practices that prioritize water conservation and soil health?
But like we said, buying organic and locally grown food is a great way to support those farmers who are already using sustainable methods.
And those farmers markets are a great way to connect with the growers and learn more about what they're doing.
Exactly. You can also look for labels like Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance certified, which mean those products were grown using practices that protect water resources and biodiversity.
Awesome. What about on a larger scale? What policy changes could make a real difference in water conservation and management?
One really important area is water pricing. In a lot of places, water is super subsidized, which just encourages overuse and waste. So putting in place water pricing mechanisms that reflect the real cost of this resource would incentivize conservation and lead to more efficient use.
So making sure that the price of water actually shows how scarce and important it is.
Exactly. Another important area is agricultural subsidies. Right now, a lot of these subsidies actually encourage unsustainable practices that are depleting water resources and damaging the soil. So shifting those subsidies to support sustainable farming would be a game changer.
It seems pretty obvious, honestly. Like, why not support the farmers who are doing the right thing for the environment and for our long-term water security?
I agree. And of course, addressing climate change is huge. Implementing policies that promote renewable energy, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and protect forests and other natural ecosystems is essential for protecting our planet's fresh water in the long term.
It sounds like a multi-pronged approach involving individual actions, policy changes, and technological innovation.
Exactly. It's a group effort that requires everyone to do their part.
And of course, we can't forget about climate change.
Right. Addressing climate change is essential to stop the long-term impacts on freshwater.
Mm-hmm.
We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, switch to renewables, and promote sustainable land management.
It's a really big challenge, but we can't ignore it.
Yeah, the stakes are high, but there's a lot of potential for positive change too. We have the knowledge, the tools, and the ingenuity to create a better future.
So let's do a quick recap for our listeners. The Earth is losing fresh water at a really scary rate because of a combination of human activity and natural climate cycles, which are being amplified by global warming.
And this is having serious effects on agriculture, regional stability, and even global security.
But there is hope we can deal with this crisis by using sustainable water management practices, reducing our reliance on groundwater, encouraging water conservation, and tackling climate change head-on.
It's going to take individual action, policy changes, and technological innovation.
By working together, we can make sure that water is a source of life and prosperity for everyone.
Well said. That's a message we need to be spreading.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and helping us understand this complicated issue.
My pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations, and I hope our listeners feel like they can make a difference.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep taking action. We all have a part to play in protecting the planet's water.
Remember, every drop counts.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a question that one of the sources asked: will fresh water levels bounce back, or is this the new normal?
That's what scientists are still trying to figure out. But one thing's for sure, the choices that we make today will determine the answer.
So let's choose wisely. That's a really powerful thought. It really makes you realize that we're not just talking about numbers here. We're talking about, like, the future of something that's absolutely essential for life.
Exactly. And it's a future that we have the power to change for good or bad. The choices we make now, both on our own and together, will decide whether freshwater keeps disappearing or if we can turn this whole thing around and make sure there's enough water for everyone in the future.
I'll be honest, going into this deep dive, I was kind of overwhelmed by just how big and complicated this issue is. But hearing you talk about it, explaining the science and the solutions so clearly, it's actually made me feel a little hopeful.
I'm glad it's easy to feel powerless when you think about these global problems. But the truth is, we all have a role to play. You know, every choice we make, every action we take it all makes a difference.
Yeah, this deep dive has definitely been a wake-up call. I'm already thinking about things I can change in my own life, like getting that low-flow shower head, being more careful about how much water I use, supporting local farmers who are doing things the right way. It feels good to know that I can actually do something to help.
That's great. And remember, it's not about being perfect or changing everything at once. It's about taking small steps, making those conscious choices, and building momentum towards a better future.
One of the biggest things I've realized is that this isn't just an environmental issue. It's a social issue, an economic issue, a geopolitical issue.
Yeah.
It affects everything, and it needs a bigger solution.
I completely agree. We need to stop thinking in boxes and start thinking about water as something that connects us all and affects every part of our society. We need everyone to be part of the conversation. Scientists, politicians, farmers, businesses, communities, individuals. We all have something at stake here.
And it all comes down to understanding the real value of water, not just as something we buy, but as this precious and limited resource that everything on Earth needs to survive.
Well said. If we can change our thinking and start appreciating water for what it really is, this life-giving force, this thing that connects us all, then we have a chance to fix this.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling a sense of urgency, but also a sense of hope. The challenges are real, but so are the solutions, and it's up to us to demand action, make those changes, and create a future where water isn't something we fight over, but something we all share and benefit from.
I couldn't agree more to everyone listening. I urge you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep taking action. The future of water is literally in our hands.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into vanishing water. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration.